If you haven't watched part 1 yet, check that out, because this is part 2. Big ol' howdy to all of my fellow and future hobbyists out there. My name is Matthew, I am your BRS beginner guru, and this is episode 40, part B, where we are going to dive into the rest of the maintenance tasks for new saltwater aquariums. So if you missed the first part, check it out, episode 40, part A. We do all of the daily and semi-weekly tasks there. So without any further ado, let's get going with all of those weekly maintenance tasks. Weekly task number 1 is water testing. In brand new tanks that have yet to be cycled, I test for ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate, as well as phosphate and the salinity. But once the tank is settled in, I usually don't test for ammonia or nitrite every week. If you're curious to know why I test for certain things and not for other things, stay tuned for next episode, episode 41, because we are going to go crazy into depth about water testing. Weekly chore number 2 is feeding your corals and your anemones. I actually rarely feed my anemones because I figure they can collect. It's the worst when you breathe wrong. While overfeeding your corals can certainly gunk up your tank, doing at least once a week feeding of your corals can really help them grow quicker and up the coloration big time. You can either broadcast feed your tank or target feed your tank. Broadcast feeding is a fancy way of just saying pouring the food into the tank and just letting it swirl around. While target feeding, on the other hand, is where you put it into some sort of plunger and feed the polyps directly. Usually that results in a little bit less waste, it just takes more effort. Let's be real here, anemones and corals, at least the photosynthetic types, which are the only types I recommend for beginners, get probably somewhere around 90%. I don't know where we get 90%, but I've heard it so many times now. But let's just say that photosynthetic corals and anemones receive the majority of the food they need from the light source, so you probably don't even need to feed them once a week. But if you feed them with a really good coral food, you could make them grow a lot faster and you could make their colors pop that much more. So why wouldn't you feed them, right? Weekly task number 3 is just to visually inspect your equipment, and I mean the equipment you can't easily see. So check out your pumps, your auto top-off units, your wave makers, your heaters. Just make sure they're in good working order. There's not a snail or some sort of detritus or algae blocking the inlet. And then you're probably going to have to pull them out once every 6 months to give them a deep clean, but at least weekly, make sure they're in good operating order. Weekly task number 4 is cleaning your protein skimmer cup. This is disgusting. My family hates it. They can smell it a mile away when I lift it off and I run to the kitchen sink. They're like, oh, what is that? And I'm like, it's a whole bunch of fish poop and gosh knows what else. But I clean it out every week. But if you can do it a little bit more than once a week, it's probably a good idea, because if you are new to this hobby, for some reason protein skimmers will just decide to overflow at some point, and then all of that gunk will just end up back in your tank. So until you know your protein skimmer well, empty it out at least once a week. For me, my protein skimmer is most likely to bubble over when I either feed the tank a certain kind of food or I change out my filter sock. I actually have my protein skimmer set on a Wi-Fi timer for 5 hours, so every time I change my filter sock or add a certain kind of food that I know will make it bubble over, I just click the timer and it turns off and back on after 5 hours. For cleaning the cup, just use some hot water. You don't have to immaculately clean it every time. You don't necessarily have to get in there with a paper towel and wipe all of that gunk out every week, but if you just use some hot water, spray it down, you can usually get a good portion of that off. Task number 5, dust your lights. I don't really think you need instructions on how to dust, but clean them off, especially the fan areas. That way it keeps your lights plenty cool. And for any of you true beginners out there, just use a cloth. You can add a little water to the cloth. Don't use anything like N-Dust or Pledge, because that stuff can make its way into your tank and screw up your water chemistry. Weekly task number 6 is to wipe down the outside and the rim of your tank. I personally don't use anything special. I just use a rag and some water, and if nobody's looking, sometimes there's a hard to get spot, I'll actually spit on it and scrub it down if I'm too lazy to go to the sink. It works just fine and it keeps it looking nicely. But you could take your cleaning to the next level and buy an aquarium safe cleaning product. I think Toonsy and API both sell versions of this. Certainly don't use any sort of chemical like a Windex or a foam cleaner on or near your tank, because aerosols can do crazy bad things to the water chemistry. So stick with water or an aquarium safe cleaning product. Weekly task number 7 is a water change. I spent an entire video on this trying to convince you that a weekly water change is hands down 100% the best preventative maintenance you can do for any new tank, especially if you're a beginner. So if you haven't watched that episode, I believe it's episode 25. We'll put a link down below so you can check it out. I personally do a 10 to 15% water change every week on all of my tanks, even the tanks that have been around for a long time. Not only does it help remove things like nitrates and phosphates and detritus and fish poop that I gravel vacuum out, but I also know it's adding back in major, minor, and trace elements, so why not? Weekly task number 8 is to change out your activated carbon if you're running it. I don't personally run activated carbon all the time, but I add it in when a tank starts smelling or gets a little discolored. But you can absolutely run activated carbon all the time. And because of how it works through a process called adsorption, activated carbon can get clogged really quickly, so it is best to be changed out every week for optimal performance. And now for those semi-monthly or every other week tasks, starting out with gravel vacuuming the sand bed. Don't go crazy here, but use the gravel vac as a part of your water change and gently clean the top portion of some part of the sand bed. You don't have to do the sand bed entirely every time, just do a small portion. If you need a refresher or haven't yet watched episode 25 about water changes, check it out because we go into a lot more detail about how to gravel vac your substrate. Every other week task number 2 is clean salt creep. You don't need to do anything fancy here. Just use a toothbrush or even your finger, dip it in water, and scrape that salt creep back into your tank. The thing about salt creep is when it starts creeping more and more and more, and eventually you end up with piles of salt on the back of your tank or on the floor. So it's much easier to just clean that salt creep every other week, and it prevents a lot of problems. Every other week task number 3 is to make RODI water. If you haven't yet bought an RODI filter because it's too overwhelming, just do it, get it out of the way, pull that band-aid off. We've made videos about RODI filters and it will save you so much money in the long run. But if you don't have an RODI filter, no big deal. Your every other week task is going to be to purchase distilled water or RODI water from your local fish store. And the 4th and final task that you need to do every other week is to clean your rear filtration chamber. How I do this is I turn off all of the pumps and I use a handheld algae scraper to scrape everything down. Then I just use my gravel vac and remove the water from the rear filtration chamber, so I pull out all of that gunk. You probably don't have to do it every other week, but you will get algae growth in there and you will get detritus buildup, so it becomes kind of a nutrient trap, and over time it really does start to smell, so it's better to clean it up every other week. That way you avoid any problems down the road. And our final category are monthly tasks, and really I only have one task for you to do every single month, and that is to change your chemical media. First, let me say that we don't recommend using chemical media except for carbon, but we don't recommend using chemical media unless you need to use it, and that's especially true for granular ferric oxide or GFO, because if you use it incorrectly or too much, you can cause a lot of problems in your tank. So for a lot more information all about chemical media, rewatch episode 22 in this series. But there are times when I need to use a small amount of GFO. Currently, my phosphate levels are just a little bit out of whack in both my clownfish harem tank and my reef tank. So I have used a small amount of GFO in a BRS reactor to bring those levels down. And what I've noticed is that GFO starts to run out of its efficacious power somewhere around a month. But the only way you're gonna really know when your GFO stops working is watching your phosphate levels slowly rise. that will be the indication that it's time to put in new GFO. Well, that's it, everybody. I'm not going to go into your semi-annual and annual tasks because that will be later down the road. I'm just trying to get you started with those maintenance tasks you're going to have to do right away after setting up your brand new saltwater aquarium. I have tried to mention a lot of the products that I personally use, and we will put links to those down below if you want more information or are ready to buy some of them. And stay tuned for next episode, episode 41A and 41B, because we are going to take a deep dive, and I know I say deep dive a lot, but we're going to talk about water testing, probably in a way you've never heard of before, which will tell you exactly what to test, when to test, and what those results mean. So stay tuned for next episode. And as always, everybody, thanks for watching. Happy reefing. Be well. We'll see you next time.